Mass Effect 1 laid the foundations for what promised to be an excellent trilogy with some of the best world building I've seen in video games. Over roughly 25 hours we learned how humanity discovered an ancient Prothean technology that let them travel to distant stars. We met loads of other alien races and even explored their complex histories and cultures. BioWare also weaved in a gripping main campaign involving a threat from an ancient race called the Reapers, who threatened to wipe out all intelligent life in the galaxy. The ending built up to a crescendo and satisfied with its conclusion, while still leaving an impending threat looming over the entire galaxy that would need to be cleared up in the inevitable sequel. That sequel arrived in the form of 2010's Mass Effect 2, which was developed after EA's acquisition of BioWare in 2007. With EA's money behind it, Mass Effect 2 is unsurprisingly bigger and more lavish in its production. Cutscenes can be incredible, conversations flow more smoothly without the awkward transitions that sometimes came from a result of dialogue choices, and combat is far more viscerally rewarding, with explosions and biotic powers flashy enough to make combat resemble an action game at times instead of a story-heavy RPG. And yet, with all this money, Mass Effect 2 fails to recreate what captured me about Mass Effect 1, the story. In my video on Mass Effect 1 I described it as a textbook example of great storytelling. We had a compelling antagonist, a mystery, plenty of new cultures to explore, and events moved at a frantic pace. Mass Effect 1 didn't feel like a 25-hour RPG, it felt like a 2-hour movie. Mass Effect 2 does nearly everything wrong with its main story. There barely is an antagonist, let alone an interesting one. There's little in the way of mystery to keep the player pushing forward, and only one new species of note to discover. Major events barely move along at all, let alone at a frantic pace. Mass Effect 2 is a bigger game than its predecessor, coming in at closer to 40 hours for a decent playthrough, but it's a far less refined one. Given all this, you might expect this video to be one long roast of Mass Effect 2 or a long rant about how EA ruined another promising franchise with the crime of offering financial support to a developer. This video does contain a hell of a lot of criticism, it's the nature of these videos, but I want to put it all into context by saying that I thoroughly enjoyed Mass Effect 2 and can completely understand why people hold it up as their favourite in the series, or even their favourite game of all time. It is a really good game. While Mass Effect 2 doesn't have a great main story, it does have a phenomenal cast of characters who each have their own shorter stories to tell. That probably sounds like little more than a consolation up against far more significant failures, but it's not. This isn't just a case of there being good side quests. Spending time with the companions on your ship and doing their loyalty missions take up the vast majority of the 40 hours runtime, so effectively this is the story. Mass Effect 2 isn't about stopping the Collectors or the Reapers, it's about forming friendships, and by that metric it succeeds. The differences between Mass Effect 1 and 2 remind me a little of Fallout 1 and 2. Fallout 1 was a shorter experience that focused on the main narrative while giving you plenty of huge choices to make along the way. Fallout 2 was bigger and the main story a lot less memorable. However, the sheer size of Fallout 2 meant a lot of people preferred the sequel, myself included, depending on the day of the week, because it allowed them to become part of the world instead of a protagonist always having to push forward a narrative. I remember Fallout 1 for the story, I remember Fallout 2 for the experience. Whereas Mass Effect 1 was like a movie, Mass Effect 2 is far more like a TV show, especially superhero shows like The Flash and Supergirl, which I have a bit of a weakness for. These shows typically have a big bad or a larger mystery that is the main focus or threat of the season, but it's often ignored in individual episodes to instead develop a side character or focus on a narrow arc. You can often label episodes as a Caitlyn episode or a Win episode, and you typically wouldn't miss anything from the main story if you skip the episode entirely. However, it does mean that whenever something major happens to those characters, you actually care about them. They've become more than sidekicks. Mass Effect 1 and 2 are incredibly different games. I personally prefer the focused approach of the first game, but it's easy to see why people would prefer the loose structure of the sequel, which lets you get to know people instead of events. Mass Effect 1 was about the adventure. It was thrilling with rarely a dull moment. Mass Effect 2 is about the journey. There are slow and tedious parts, but when things ramp up, the payoff is huge. Mass Effect 2's story problems are likely the result of it not only being the middle of a trilogy, but also a trilogy that wasn't planned out from the start. The second story in a trilogy is always tricky. You can't entertain the audience by introducing new characters and worlds, and you can't offer any satisfying resolution either. In fact, the middle of a trilogy is more likely than most to end on an unsatisfying cliffhanger. That's not to say the middle episode will always be the worst, just that the odds are stacked against it. The Two Towers in the Lord of the Rings trilogy stands out as an example of the middle being the strongest, while the third Matrix movie was so disappointing that Reloaded secured second place by default. BioWare claims that Mass Effect was always designed as a trilogy, but I think it's fair to say it was designed with the potential to be a trilogy rather than a series with 3 detailed outlines in place from the start. I cannot believe for 1 minute there was an outline in place for Mass Effect 2 from the beginning that had so little in terms of major story development taking place. The story description would have been make friends in preparation for the third game. As I discussed in my video, Mass Effect clearly laid the groundwork for more stories, but that doesn't mean there was a detailed plan on the office wall. I've read a lot of book trilogies that have this issue. Brandon Sanderson is one of my favourite authors. The first MISTBORN book was a fast-paced story that established a world, characters and a magic system of sorts. I loved it. The second book was far less focused. There was clearly more story to tell, but if it weren't for the fact that marketing departments love trilogies, I suspect this would have been better as a 2-book series with books 2 and 3 combined. This often happens when the first book is from a new or relatively inexperienced author. For example, Robin Hobb's first book, Assassin's Apprentice, was great in many of the same ways that the first MISTBORN book was. The second book was boring in many of the same ways the second MISTBORN book was. It was too long and self-indulgent. I suspect that the success of the first book gives the author more time and influence when writing the successor, and there aren't enough people to say no. The editors have less power over the author. Mass Effect 2 has a similar problem. As the first game was wrapping up, EA stepped in and provided significant financial resources, and you can see that money from the opening scene. Compared to the first game, the money being spent is obvious. BioWare might as well have put its bank statement up on the screen. This intro is thrilling even if you are largely watching events unfold without contributing much. 2 months after the Reaper attack on the Citadel, Shepard is in charge of pushing the remaining Geth back to the Perseus Veil, when her ship is blown up by a species known as the Collectors. The Collectors are a group of aliens who live at the other end of the Omega-4 mass relay. Not a lot is known about them because whenever a ship tries to travel through the relay, they never return. Collectors occasionally trade with known species, however, so while some people regard them as a myth, others readily accept their existence. Shepard manages to get most of her crew to safety before the ship blows up and she is ejected into space. We watch the air leak from her suit as she slowly dies. Perhaps not the introduction you were expecting. I still remember being absolutely baffled when I first played Mass Effect 2 and watched this scene. I hadn't played Mass Effect 1 at the time and was wondering what the hell I'd got myself into. Shepard uses magical powers to slowly pull herself back towards the ship where... oh no wait, that's a different space franchise. Shepard does in fact die, that's not a fake out. However, her body is recovered by a group of pro-human activists called Cerberus, led by the Elusive Man, voiced perfectly by Martin Sheen. The comic book Redemption goes into a lot more detail about how Shepard's body was recovered, with Liara playing a key role in making sure it ended up with Cerberus instead of the Shadow Broker. We also see that the Elusive Man was creating a clone of Shepard as a backup, but that doesn't come up in the events of this game. The Elusive Man decides that Shepard is so important due to her previous actions that she is worth spending over 4 billion credits bringing back to life. The Elusive Man tells Shepard that the Collectors are likely working with the Reapers and need to be stopped. He then gives her a list of people to recruit for the task. As prologues go, this one is equal parts exciting and baffling. There's some excellent cinematography, and seeing the ship you remember so fondly from the first game get torn apart is a touch emotional. Even during such hectic moments, I couldn't help but stop and admire the view as Shepard stepped onto the destroyed deck in the cold vacuum of space on her way to helping Joker. It's a powerful moment, and maybe that's why it's here, simply as an easy way to hit the player hard early on with moments they won't quickly forget. That's not a terrible reason. Creating emotional moments is what art is all about. However, the whole thing still feels utterly bizarre all these years later. Bringing a character back from the dead is a fairly extreme move. No matter what crazy world has been created and how much magic is available, death is usually final. When it's not, it risks removing the tension that should exist when characters are placed in positions of peril. It's not something to be taken lightly and should be saved for situations when it's truly necessary to bring a character back, or if the act of bringing people back to life is somehow to be a core part of the story itself. For example, I'm still not convinced Jon Snow needed to be killed and resurrected in Game of Thrones. I'm convinced this was solely done to provide a cliffhanger at the end of the A Feast for Crows book, as opposed to showing the reader or viewer that resurrection was possible in Westeros. We already know that it is. However, I will wait until the series is finished before passing any final judgment on that one. So why does it happen in Mass Effect 2? I would completely understand Shepard's resurrection at the beginning of Mass Effect 2 if she'd been killed off in Mass Effect 1. She nearly was. There's a brief moment where you wonder whether she's been crushed under rubble after the final fight before she shows that she's just fine. After playing Mass Effect 2's intro again, my prevailing thought is that perhaps she should have died on the Citadel in the first game. Sure, we'd all suspect that Shepard would return in the sequel, but it would be a decent mystery to start things off and would likely have been great for promotional materials. Or BioWare and EA could have pretended that Mass Effect 2 would have started a new protagonist and had the resurrection be a surprise, well, for all about 5 minutes until people started tweeting about it anyway. It shouldn't be that difficult to pull off in a game where you create your own protagonist. After all, you wouldn't have to show a familiar looking Shepard in trailers. That might have been fun, but that's not how the first game ended, so it's all hypothetical. The reason for Shepard's death could just be a cynical exercise in giving players the feels early on and showing off with expensive cutscenes, but I'm going to go with a slightly more favourable viewpoint. Shepard dies and is resurrected by Cerberus so that both Shepard and the player feel a debt to the elusive man and Cerberus. Otherwise there's simply no way Shepard would consider working with what is quite frankly a terrorist organisation, and the player would feel that disconnect the entire time. Bringing Shepard back from the dead is an extreme step to take, but probably a necessary one. Even after Cerberus spent billions of credits bringing Shepard back to life, I'm still not convinced we shouldn't just walk away and do things by ourselves. The elusive man talks about wanting to stop the Reaper threat, but it's also clear that his priority is to save humanity. You get the impression he doesn't much care what happens to the other races so long as humanity survives. The backstory of the elusive man is told in the Evolution comic, although it's not a great read. I wouldn't recommend buying it separately, although it's part of the omnibus editions if you have those. Essentially, the elusive man loses some close friends during the First Contact War and spends a lot of time banging on about how superior humans are to other races. If you did the side missions in Mass Effect 1, you will have seen Cerberus use Thresher Maws to kill Alliance troops, perform experiments on people, and kill without hesitation. The second Mass Effect novel, Ascension, takes place while Shepard is dead and doesn't exactly paint Cerberus in a positive light either. Cerberus is a terrible group of people and the elusive man is a tyrant, but Shepard doesn't put up much of a fight when it comes to working with him. Our only justification for working with Cerberus is that its resources will be essential if the Reapers are to be stopped, which, as excuses go, is not a terrible one, but it never feels like we properly explore all of the alternatives. Instead, you can tell the writers wanted the player to work for a shadowy organisation and came up with a justification afterwards. To give an example of just how bad Cerberus is, we reunited Ashley early on while trying to stop collectors abducting humans from a colony. Ashley, as you may remember, was very much a Humanity First crewmate in the first game. She softened up slightly by the end of the game, but you know the type. She'd always be that person who accidentally lets slip a racial slur and follows it up with a bad apology video before doing the same thing again a few weeks later. Ashley is familiar with the idea of humans looking after themselves first and foremost, and yet she is absolutely disgusted to find out that Shepard is working for Cerberus, even though Shepard tries to explain that she is the one in control of the mission. Look, when someone like Ashley thinks you've gone too far, it might be time to reconsider what you're doing. You should be scared at how low you've stooped based on the reactions of other terrible people. The writers at BioWare must have been really keen to have Martin Sheen and the elusive man take centre stage, because in addition to having Cerberus resurrect Shepard, they also make it clear that the Alliance will not help Shepard at all through somewhat contrived circumstances. Early on in the game you can go to the Citadel and talk to the Council, assuming you save them in the first game, however they refuse to help. The Council and the Human Alliance as a whole has seemingly convinced themselves that there is no Reaper threat. Apparently Sovereign was either a one-off or just an advanced ship that Saren somehow managed to get hold of. Problem solved. Don't get me wrong, I can totally understand those in power pretending not to understand a problem that threatens to destroy planets and make species extinct. However, it's still disappointing to see how irrelevant the Council is in the sequel. The two major decisions Shepard made at the end of Mass Effect 1 were whether to save the Council and who to put in charge going forward. It doesn't make much difference because no matter what you did, the Council buries its head in the sand. The easiest way to rationalise all this is just to imagine that Shepard needs resources to stop the Reapers and doesn't much care where they come from. It's not ideal, but without this contrivance we wouldn't have Martin Sheen being awesome, so it's best to take the bad with the good. Cerberus' project to resurrect Shepard took 2 years. During that time, Cerberus tracked down Joker and built a brand new version of the Normandy ship, complete with a couple of upgrades that Joker appreciates for the most part. He's not so keen on the ship AI, Edie. You might remember that artificial intelligence is supposed to be illegal in the Mass Effect world. The Council's given express permission to a couple of corporations to perform AI research, however I don't think Cerberus is one of them. People were rightly suspicious of AI after the Quarians built the Geth, who ended up rebelling against their creators and causing a spot of bother when they teamed up with Saren and Sovereign. Here though, people are generally accepting of ED, even though this technology should be equal parts mind-blowing and threatening. One cool touch is the 15-minute comic book section that lets you make decisions you would have made if you'd played Mass Effect 1, or the decisions you did in fact make if you played it and imported your save. The comic is clearly supposed to be read before the prologue instead of between the prologue and the main story. It ends with Shepard going off to hunt down the remaining Geth, but you read it just after she has died. BioWare likely thought that starting its new game with 15 minutes of drawings wasn't a great idea, which is why this gets shunted off until after the prologue, but someone should have probably told the people writing the comic. With the introduction out of the way, Mass Effect 2 descends into one of the clearest 3-act structures I've ever seen. In the first act you follow the suggestion of the elusive man and hunt down a bunch of potential team members. In the second act you earn the loyalty of those team members. In the third act you take the fight to the Collectors with your new team. You'll notice that the descriptions of the first 2 acts don't have much to do with progressing any story relating to the Collectors or Reapers. The Collectors are abducting human colonies, but it's not treated as an immediate threat. Cerberus is more concerned with why the Collectors are doing this, not on stopping them immediately. It's not uncommon for an RPG to have building a team as a major part of the story. However, the crucial point is that usually you build your team in the process of trying to resolve other problems. It's supposed to happen organically, or at least with the illusion that it's organic. Just look at the first game. You met Ashley randomly while searching for a Prothean device. You met Rex early on while exploring the Citadel. You met Garrus while finding evidence against Sauron. No doubt that's a lot of fortunate coincidences, but it feels natural. In Mass Effect 2 you are simply told to build your team, and the individual missions are literally just go and recruit the Assassin, or go and recruit the Archangel, or go and recruit the Justicar. I'd much prefer it if you were, say, given a mission along the lines of go to Omega to speak to a merchant who is known to have dealt with the Collectors. Then during that mission perhaps the merchant sets you up and you have to be saved by the Asari Justicar who ends up joining your team. The end result is the same, but the process is at least slightly disguised. The second act plays out in much the same way. The loyalty missions, as they're widely known, pop up in your journal with the simple request to go and talk to a crew member on board the Normandy. From there they ask you for a favour and you can choose whether or not to help them. A smoother solution might be to have normal quests which are then interrupted by a crew member asking you to help with a personal problem while you're on the planet or in the system. For example, you're about to head down to Ilium. Miranda asks if she can be part of the ground team because she has a lead on her sister. You can choose whether or not to accept her request, and even when down on the planet dealing with an issue hopefully pertinent to the main story, you can decide whether to help her with the mission. This would also largely resolve the story disconnect of going off to solve personal problems when there is a galaxy-wide threat looming in the distance. Regardless of the sloppy way in which they are introduced, the companions and their stories are absolutely the highlight of Mass Effect 2. Some of them are technically optional, but in no way do you get a true Mass Effect experience if you ignore them. In terms of character development and bonding, they are some of the best side quests you can experience, and you owe it to yourself to explore them thoroughly. Like I said before, side quest isn't even the right term, but because you can skip some of them, it's probably the most appropriate. I mentioned in my Mass Effect 1 video that while the companions did have small side quests for you to complete, it mainly felt like the companions were there to serve as information repositories for their respective species. Tali told you about the history of the Quarians, namely their creation of the Geth and subsequent near annihilation, leading to them being effectively homeless and confined to a fleet of 50,000 ships. Thanks to Tali, we also know that Quarians are expected to go on a pilgrimage and bring back something of value, at which point they become fully fledged members of their ship. Rex was the main source of information about the Krogan genophage, which is without a doubt the most fascinating and fleshed out part of the history of Mass Effect's galaxy. Liara provided necessary information dumps about the Protheans, Garrus was useful as an insight into Citadel politics, Ashley showed us the human first mentality, and Kaiden hung around for a bit as well. Completing companion loyalty quests in Mass Effect 2 still expands your knowledge of the universe and its various species, but that is merely a consequence of getting closer to the companion in question. Their personal stories are given precedence over information dumps. Picking my favourite companion mission would be like a parent picking their favourite child. They totally have an answer in mind, but there's no way they'd say it out loud for fear of hurting people. The official response has to be that I love them all equally, except Jacob, the Kaiden of Mass Effect 2. Jack's missions should make you wonder how Shepard can continue working for Cerberus at all. The recruitment and subsequent loyalty missions hit me as hard as they hit Jack. When you meet her, Jack is a prisoner on Purgatory, a for-profit prison ship. She's the most feared criminal in the building, so much so that when another prisoner finds out you plan to take Jack with you, he changes his mind about wanting you to free him. Given the cruel treatment on display in the cell next door, this should tell you something about Jack's violent tendencies. Jack is a phenomenally powerful human biotic, capable of easily destroying multiple large mechs as she attempts to escape the prison. In the end, she has no choice but to join up with Shepard because it's the only way off the ship. However, she is reluctant to do so when she sees you are working with Cerberus, the group she accuses of experimenting on her when she was young. After promising her access to Cerberus files or bluffing and having her take them anyway, she joins the crew and makes a home for herself alone in the engineering deck. At this stage I'm wondering why on earth my Paragon version of Shepard would want a deranged murderer on the team. Jack is clearly a powerful biotic, but she also kills for fun and would likely cause more harm than good as part of a team. Even though the Purgatory facility was a fairly despicable place, she was there for a good reason if the story she tells about her past are true. The warden at Purgatory couldn't control her and had to keep her in stasis until he found a buyer. She's not someone you want to mess with, and at least initially I didn't personally want her on my team. But then Jack asks for a favour. She wants to take a short detour to blow up a facility where she claims Cerberus experimented on her as a child. Before giving herself the name Jack, she was known as Subject Zero, and along with other biotic children was regularly tested to push the limit of her powers. Jack had a terrible time here, not only experimented on by Cerberus, but also shunned and ignored by the other children. She was an outcast in a group of outcasts. When Jack escaped, the children all sided with the guards and tried to prevent her leaving. She killed them in response. As you explore the facility, you discover that things weren't quite as Jack remembered. Jack wasn't just another biotic child that Cerberus experimented on. Jack was the reason Cerberus experimented on those other children. The other children were the guinea pigs for new medicines and enhancements that might benefit Subject Zero. Those children were abused, killed and discarded, all in the name of making Jack more powerful. When Cerberus perfected a new drug, it would then give it to Jack to improve her biotic abilities. It's no wonder the other children disliked Jack, although even that isn't as clear cut as Jack made out. She tells Shepard about how she would try to talk to the other children through the window of her cell and they always ignored her. On rediscovering her cell as part of this mission, Jack realises that it is made of two-way glass. The children weren't ignoring her on purpose, they just couldn't see or hear her. The children also didn't attack Jack when she tried to escape. In the chaos of Jack's breakout, guards opened fire on the children, so the children rushed to Jack knowing that the guards wouldn't risk killing her. They weren't attacking Jack at all, they were looking for protection and she responded by attacking them. Obviously it wasn't Jack's fault, she'd been tortured and abused for years and had no way of knowing what was happening. Blame lies firmly at Cerberus's door. Cerberus's excuse for this entire abomination of a facility is that it was the work of a rogue operative. The elusive man claims Cerberus wanted to help these children, but the people in charge went too far. Cerberus shut the facility down after Jack escaped. I don't buy his excuse for 1 second. Not just because Cerberus is a shady operation with dubious motives, but specifically because of the events of the book Ascension, which also involves Cerberus experimenting on a powerful young biotic child. Ascension makes a couple of things clear. First, the elusive man fully believes that biotic powers are essential to the future of humanity in the galaxy, and he isn't above torturing children to help develop these powers in gifted youngsters. In Ascension, a 12-year-old partly autistic girl called Gillian is drugged with experimental concoctions to determine what will bring out the full extent of her powers. With help, Gillian escapes the facility, and in order to get her back, Cerberus slaughters anyone who gets in the way, including the innocent Quarians on whose ship she happened to take refuge. It's absolutely conceivable to me that the elusive man knew about the experiments on Jack and the other children, and that he either gave explicit permission or let them continue no matter what the cost. Even if the elusive man didn't know about the experiments, you could still argue that he's responsible. We see numerous times that people who work for the elusive man are terrified of failing him, and that he will shut down projects if they don't meet their goals and punish those he deems responsible for failure. When the elusive man assigns you the task of effectively powering up Subject Zero to her full potential, you can be damn sure he knows the extent to which people will go to satisfy his desires. Grunt and Mordin's loyalty missions both take you to the Krogan homeworld of Tuchanka. Grunt is a genetically engineered Krogan who Shepard can rescue while he is still dormant in his test tube and then awaken while on the ship. Grunt's creation is itself fascinating. A Krogan warlord known as Akir was studying the genophage when he realised his efforts would be better spent genetically creating a perfect Krogan. I'm not entirely convinced about his rationale for this. Akir believed it was wrong to treat the Krogan who survived the genophage as being superior to those who didn't. I agree with that part. All it means is that they didn't succumb to the disease that usually kills before they are born. It doesn't mean they are inherently powerful. However, curing the genophage would surely still be a preferable solution to creating Krogan in a tube. Still, that's how Grunt came to be. Grunt was born as an adult. He only knows the information that was fed to him by Akir while he was growing in the tube, and is therefore confused by a sudden onset of anger and aggression that he doesn't know how to control. He is essentially going through Krogan puberty. By taking Grunt to Tuchanka, you can find out that he needs to undergo a rite of passage, which is essentially just defeating a couple of waves of enemies and surviving or potentially killing a Threshermaw. Completing the rite of passage helps Grunt let off steam and he becomes a more stable member of the team. The mission in itself isn't especially interesting, however the insight into Krogan society is fascinating, as is seeing the results of your decision on whether or not to kill Rex in the first game. If you let Rex live, he is now head of Clan Urdnot on Tuchanka. He is trying to unite Krogan clans with the common goal of curing the genophage, however his peaceful approach has attracted plenty of criticism. Many Krogans don't believe Grunt should be able to join a clan, or be recognised as a Krogan at all, seeing him as fake due to the circumstances of his birth. In both Mass Effect games so far, when people have defended the genophage, they've described the Krogans in ways that make them sound like little more than animals who would have no choice but to go to war with the galaxy. It has to be said, the Krogans we meet on Tuchanka don't do a great job at countering this argument. They seem more concerned with internal squabbles than doing anything about the genophage. Mordin, the Solarian scientist you rescue early on, states that he ran millions of different possible scenarios, and every one resulted in war, which would eventually lead to complete extinction of the Krogan race. I took Mordin along to Tuchanka, expecting him as a Solarian to get a lot of abuse from the local Krogans, but his presence was hardly mentioned. I initially thought this was a flaw in the writing. a failure to include dialogue for NPCs reacting to a companion, and perhaps that's the case. It's also possible that the Krogan are simply too busy with domestic politics to care. Of course, this is likely due to the genophage itself. If the genophage never happened, the Krogan wouldn't need to worry so much about the future of their species. Mordin's quest is focused on the genophage. Mordin used to be a part of the Special Tasks Group, essentially the Solarian equivalent of the SAS, which is why he's so handy in combat. However, he's also a doctor and a scientist and was part of a team studying the effects of the genophage. The team noticed that the Krogan were naturally overcoming the genophage, so he modified the disease, effectively creating Genophage 2.0, which would continue to limit Krogan reproduction. I want to love Mordin, but he doesn't make it easy. His speech pattern is adorable, and I could listen to him all day if it wasn't for the things he actually says. No matter how many times you tell him that the genophage was wrong, he defends it in a cold-hearted, logical way that fails to take into account the people affected by his actions. His loyalty mission brings those consequences to the fore. Mordin wants to go to Tuchanka to rescue Malon, a former assistant of his who has been kidnapped by the Krogan. Mordin assumes Malon is being forced to work on a cure for the genophage, but in actuality Malon is doing so completely of his own volition. Malon thinks the genophage was a mistake and is doing what he can to reverse it. Before finding Malon, we discover dead bodies such as that of a female Krogan who willingly underwent tests to try and rectify her infertility. Mordin is disgusted at the tests Malon performed and thinks Malon went too far, while Malon defends his work as being for the greater good. They're both wrong. Malon's experiments were obviously brutal, however they would never have happened if it weren't for the genophage work done by Mordin in the first place. Mordin is disgusted by what he sees because this time he actually has to see the results of his handiwork. Mordin thinks of the genophage as a theoretical exercise. It's maths and numbers. Statistically, the genophage is the best option for the Krogan and therefore the right thing to do in his eyes. He never had to spend time among the Krogan and see what was happening to them and their culture. Now he's forced to stare the consequences face on, and while he doesn't like what he sees, he still isn't prepared to take full responsibility. He's getting there though. At the end of Mordin's mission you can choose whether or not to keep Malon's data, which if I recall correctly will be a big factor in Mass Effect 3. Samara and Thane need your help dealing with their unruly children. Samara is a Justicar, an Asari who has sworn allegiance to a code of justice and lives her entire life by this code. Justicars are feared and respected for good reason. It isn't easy to become a Justicar in the first place and you don't want to mess with them. Messing with them in this case is doing anything wrong in their presence. I'm not entirely convinced by the supposedly strict ethics of this code of justice because it sounds like a Justicar can kill you just for jaywalking if they feel like it. After recruiting Samara, she asks you to track down her daughter, who is an Ardat Yakshi, an Asari who has a disease that kills their mates during intercourse. Ardat Yakshi are rare, however they tend to be more common as the offspring of two Asari, which is another reason Asari often take mates from other species. Samara has 3 children, all of whom are Ardat Yakshi. However, 2 of them agreed to live a life of isolation and aren't a threat to anyone else. However, Morinth has been on a murder spree for 400 years, and shows no signs of stopping. She killed a young girl on Omega just before Shepard started hunting her down. Shepard agrees to act as romantic bait until Samara appears and does battle with her daughter. You can choose which one you want to save, so if you have an extreme sexual fetish you can bring Morinth on board. There are probably worse ways to go out. Thane Krios is a Drell assassin with some dubious ethics and a fascinating history. The Drell race faced extinction due to what sounds a bit like climate change on their home planet. The Hanar, the race that looks a bit like jellyfish, rescued a couple of 100,000 Drell and brought them back to the Hanar homeworld, although billions were left behind to die. The Drell felt a huge debt of gratitude to the Hanar for this help and agreed to the compact, under which they help the Hanar with tasks they cannot do themselves. In the case of Thane, that meant becoming an assassin. Thane's Foundation comic tells the story of how he met his future wife while on a contract. She stopped him from killing someone, they fell in love, and the Hanar granted him permission to leave the compact. However, Thane ended up working as a freelance assassin, and one of his jobs led to the brutal murder of his wife. There is a Foundation comic for every character in Mass Effect 2, but Thane's is one of the few worth reading. Thane isn't a cold-hearted killer as such. He does his job but prays for his own soul after each murder. As far as Thane is concerned, he is just a weapon and therefore doesn't bear any responsibility for the murders. While this should make Thane an unlikable character, I found him to be fairly sympathetic. He has a perfect memory and often relives previous events in what looks like excruciating clarity. Thane is also dying. He has a disease called Keprel syndrome, the result of living in the humid climate on the Hanar homeworld. Before he dies, he wants to stop his son following in his assassin footsteps, and requests Shepard's help to prevent his son completing his next contract. The loyalty mission itself isn't especially memorable, but Thane attempting to reconcile with his son certainly is. There's no immediate resolution, but in my main playthrough it looked like the two of them would connect meaningfully before Thane's disease ran its course. Thane's missions are another example of how efficiently BioWare can develop characters and entire species in a short amount of time. I knew nothing of the Drell before Mass Effect 2, and within the space of a couple of interesting conversations I discovered they nearly went extinct, were rescued by another race who we also don't know much about, and they willingly served that race to pay back the debt. However, being saved by the Hanar brought its own set of risks, such that leaving climate-controlled environments puts the Drell at risk of a fatal illness, Keppel syndrome. This information could have been delivered through a journal or codex entry dump. However, instead we get a couple of gripping conversations that set up Thane's loyalty missions. Thane should be an unsympathetic character. He is an assassin who takes no responsibility for his actions. However, excellent writing can make you care about anyone, and Thane is a great example of that. Late on in the game you meet Legion, the name you give to a group of 1,183 Geth programs, although for simplicity purposes I'll just stick to referring to Legion as this individual Geth. You save Legion during a main story mission and can choose to either turn him back on or sell him to Cerberus. Legion tells you that not all Geth want to fight humanity, describing the Geth who sided with Sauron as heretics. For Legion's loyalty mission he asks you to stop these heretics from spreading a virus that would convert all other Geth into heretics as well. You can probably predict how this mission is going to end. Yes, you're faced with the choice of either destroying the virus permanently along with the heretical Geth, or reversing the virus and converting those Geth into ones like Legion. The choice between brainwashing the Geth or killing them shouldn't be a particularly difficult decision, assuming you just think of it as reprogramming machines. However, my conversations with Legion had already somewhat humanised the Geth by this point, and I no longer saw them as just machines who were usually shooting at me. Brainwashing still seemed like a better option than killing them and was the dedicated Paragon choice, so I went with it. However, I wonder whether the choice would have been presented in the same way if it were an organic race such as the Quarians. Would brainwashing really be a Paragon choice if it deprived Quarians, Asari or humans of their free will? I'm not sure, but the fact I even thought about this after having Legion on board for only a couple of hours is another credit to BioWare's writing. Jacob's loyalty mission is only memorable for what is almost comical racism. When you go looking for Jacob's father, Jacob is regularly told he looks like the man in charge, who of course turns out to be his father. Except Jacob looks nothing like this guy, they're just both black. My renegade shepherd looked more like Jacob when a mod bugged out and gave him blackface. At least I'll remember Jacob for something. I think my female shepherd slept with him, but both her and me are pretending it never happened. Let's not forget the returning characters from Mass Effect 1, Tali and Garrus. We also meet Liara, but she's not available as a companion. The reintroductions are a touch strange. Presumably BioWare didn't want to animate a bunch of different meetings based on our previous relationships with these characters, so there's usually just an awkward greeting where Shepard meets them again for the first time in 2 years. As an awkward British guy, this is perfectly normal for me, but it's not how I envision these characters acting in big emotional moments. Tali Zora has completed the pilgrimage she was on when we first met her, and is now known as Tali Zora Vas Nima to signify that she is now a full member of the Nima ship, for the time being at least. The Quarian Admiralty Board has demanded she return to the Quarian fleet to answer the charge of treason. The treason charge is a little spurious. She sent Geth components back to the Geth fleet, intending to help with Quarian research of the Geth. These Geth components later went rogue as fully fledged Geth, and the Admiralty Board blames Tali, which is a little ridiculous. If you go and investigate, you discover that Tali's father was using the components to rebuild Geth to test out weapons as part of a plan to build a new homeworld for the Quarians. Tali begs you not to report her father's actions to the board. She'd rather be found guilty herself than have her father posthumously exiled from the fleet. Tali is found innocent of the treason charge, however going forward she is known as Tali Zora Vas Normandy, to signify her status on Shepard's crew. Tali also has a run-in with Legion on the ship where she catches him sending information on the Quarians to other Geth. Tali's mission fits in particularly well with the Ascension novel, which has a heavy focus on Quarians. It's the little touches like how Tali requests a security and quarantine crew meet the ship when they dock. Out of context, this sounds like an odd request because we know there's no reason for security to come and meet us. However, from the book we know this is a standard request Quarians make when docking, and it would have been suspicious if she hadn't said it. Tali's loyalty mission is a definite highlight, in part because it stars the excellent Shora Agdashlu, who plays Avasarala in the Expanse series. You may also recognise her voice from Destiny.
I'm afraid I did, Tali. The Admiralty Board moved to have you tried under that name, given your departure from the Nima.
Garrus was busy while Shepard was presumed dead. He took it upon himself to tackle organised crime on Omega and made a few enemies in the process. During this time he is betrayed by another Turian known as Sidonis and asks Shepard to help him seek revenge. You can read about this in the Foundation comic, but I don't think it adds much beyond what Garrus tells you. Revenge missions are fairly common among the loyalty missions and all end in much the same way. If you're a renegade, you'll let your teammate get his or her revenge, and if you're a paragon, you'll stop them and they'll likely feel better about themselves afterwards. Garrus and Zaid both have similar loyalty missions, and Jack and Kasumi are also focused on getting revenge. The revenge missions, especially Garrison Zaid's, are good illustrations of the continuing problems I have with the Paragon Renegade system. When I first played Mass Effect 2 back in 2010, I remember quite liking the system, but the more I replay these games, the more I'm convinced they are a waste of time. In my video on the first game, I described how the Paragon route felt like the obvious canon choice, and the Renegade options were always inconsistent, and I felt like an angry teenager, not a hero out to save the galaxy. It's not that you can't have an enjoyable playthrough as Renegade Shepard, or that the Renegade decisions can't be interesting. It's just that a Paragon playthrough is clearly so much more satisfying and narratively consistent. There are still issues with dialogue being the same regardless of what you chose, and Renegade Shepard still acts like a child and prioritises disagreeing with people over maintaining any kind of consistent personality. For example, he scolds Liara for threatening people even though that's exactly what he would do. One Renegade decision has you kill someone in cold blood. He's hardly above a few angry words. Conversely, during a conversation with Jack, the Renegade response is that she should try to put her past behind her, which actually seems like a decent thing to say. There are issues with Paragon choices as well, such as when intimidation was considered a Paragon choice. Anyway, I discussed the Paragon and Renegade system quite a bit in my last video, and I don't want to repeat all that. Most of what I said there still stands in the sequel. I want to focus on the problems I have with this system that weren't apparent in Mass Effect 1. For this video I carried forward the two playthroughs I did for the first Mass Effect, namely one Paragon playthrough as FemShep and one Renegade playthrough as MaleShep. I consider the Paragon playthrough to be my main playthrough, and the Renegade one is more to experiment with different choices and see how things play out over the trilogy. In the first game it was relatively easy to distinguish between the two playthroughs, I just made opposite decisions wherever possible. However, Mass Effect 2 is a little more complicated. I had to decide whether I wanted to keep the focus on having two distinctive characters or two distinctive playthroughs. If I wanted to keep my playthroughs as different as possible, I would have done all the loyalty missions in my Paragon playthrough, and wouldn't have done any in the Renegade playthrough, and deliberately let things go to shit at the end. However, that wouldn't be fair on Renegade Shepard because, while he's a bit of an asshole, he still wants to succeed, and some of the loyalty missions would appeal to his sensibilities. I decided to focus on keeping my characters consistent and not worry quite so much about how the game would end. The plan was for Renegade Shepard to do the loyalty missions that he would be interested in. He wanted to help Garrison Zaid get revenge. He wanted to help Jack because he liked a psychopathic murderer vibe, and he helped Grunt because he respected the Krogan as an important ally. He didn't care at all about helping find Miranda's sister or helping Thane with his son. He agreed to help Samara because he was curious about an Asari who killed through mating. That was the plan anyway. I ended up having to do a couple more loyalty missions because the major story events hadn't triggered yet. Having to put this much thought into which loyalty missions I should and shouldn't do isn't ideal. It requires players to roleplay so deeply that they ignore important quests, and on the higher difficulty settings where you need the XP, you have to make the choice to hinder your future progress. Samara's loyalty mission is a good example of how these can be more interesting because you can side with Samara or her daughter. I went into this mission planning to kill Samara at the end and recruit her daughter. I knew this was an option because I'd experienced it in my Paragon playthrough. However, despite having around 75% in the Renegade stat, I couldn't make the choice at the end this time. It seems odd that a Paragon could choose to kill Samara here whereas a Renegade couldn't because, presumably, the Renegade score was not quite high enough. If I'd done the missions in another order, this might have played out differently. Thane's loyalty mission also had a few Paragon Renegade missteps. You need to interrogate a witness, and the Paragon option is to tell Thane to be the good cop, which of course leaves you as the bad cop. From that point on, you'll only get options to be a Renegade, and if you don't take these opportunities, you'll fail to get the information you need. It sounds obvious that you need to tell Thane to be the bad cop and be the good cop in turn, however, by this point it's ingrained into your brain that the top option is good and the bottom option is bad. It's hard to go against that instinct. Most of the other loyalty missions are clearly designed for Paragon players. Garrison Zaid's revenge quests are the most obvious examples. If you let them get their revenge, the mission is over and you gain their loyalty. However, you only see notable character growth if you convince them not to kill their targets. Renegade players complete an objective and move on. Paragon players get to participate and watch their companions put their past behind them and focus on the future. Actually, Zaid's character is a bit of a mess all round. When you first meet him, he shoots someone unnecessarily and is generally acting like a dick. Paragon Shepard doesn't bat an eyelid and welcomes him aboard. During his loyalty mission, the Paragon option is to earn his loyalty at gunpoint, which seems utterly bizarre, both as a way to gain someone's trust and as a way to be a Paragon. Life's not all bad for Renegades though. The big new feature in the Paragon Renegade system is the interrupts, and this works far better for Renegades than Paragons. At specific points throughout the game, you'll be prompted to interrupt proceedings with either a Renegade or Paragon action. Think of it a bit like an optional QuickTime event. For Renegades, this system provides some excellent moments, such as opting just to shoot a bad guy instead of listening to them monologue. It's a great feature and provides a tangible reward because you can take out enemies you'd otherwise have to defeat in a firefight. I see this as exactly how a Paragon Renegade system should work. Life is sometimes easier if you're prepared to be a dick. Taking the moral high ground often results in more work, so far so good. However, it's not all Renegade interrupts. There are Paragon options as well, and these are often incredibly forced. You can tell BioWare wanted there to be a roughly equal number of interrupts for both playstyles, but it's far less intuitive to have Paragon interrupts. When you first meet Mordin, you can choose to do either a Paragon or Renegade interrupt, which either tells him to take a deep breath and calm down or get to the point. This works. It's perhaps a little gimmicky and something that could have been resolved through the conversation tree, but it works. However, most Paragon options don't work well when implemented as what is effectively a QuickTime event. During the Justicar mission, you get the option to comfort a grieving mother. This could easily have been a choice presented via the conversation wheel, but instead you're forced to quickly mash a button to comfort someone. It's a complete contradiction. As the player, you have to react in a prompt and likely panicky fashion, while the character responds by slowly reaching out and offering support. It's utterly bizarre. Having to react quickly to get off an unexpected shot is one thing. Offering emotional support is quite another. There was also a QuickTime event for giving an injured person a med pack. It's just silly. An example of the Paragon system working is when you reach out to stop a companion shooting someone, but that's about the only time it feels appropriate. It's not that I dislike the system of interrupts at all, it can work incredibly well, especially with the Renegades, but the idea that there always needs to be a balance between the two morality systems is a huge hindrance to the system being a success. Not everything needs to be for both types of character. If it doesn't fit, don't use it. I would have been completely fine with the interrupts being either exclusively or mainly used for Renegades, with Paragon options only available where appropriate. Yes, this means Paragons lose out on occasion and may have to work a little harder, but maintaining Shepard's high morals should come with a cost. If you don't need to sacrifice anything, the choice is inherently less interesting. None of these issues get to the real problem with a Renegade playthrough, which is the decision to show Shepard's Renegade status through worsening scars and glowing red eyes. This probably doesn't bother a lot of people, but I absolutely cannot stand it. The red eyes and scars look beyond ridiculous. I half expected Shepard to grow horns and a tail near the end of my Renegade playthrough. Why on earth does there have to be something so obviously video gamey, for want of a better word, when your choices are already reflected through the characters and story? If you play as a Paragon, then your scars heal with time, but you don't grow wings and a halo. If you hate these scars as much as me, then you can spend 50,000 platinum, which is a lot, on a medbay that heals them permanently, but they shouldn't have been a thing in the first place. I ended up keeping them just because I was curious to see how bad they could get. I hate using the word immersion because it's so overused and usually incorrectly used when discussing video games, but I do truly consider this to be immersion breaking. It's hard to have a serious conversation when Shepard looks like he's possessed or channeling a spell. One of the great things about the Mass Effect games is that your choices have real consequences, and therefore you shouldn't need to worry about a Paragon Renegade meter at all. The entire colour-coded system could easily be removed with the choices left in and let the consequences speak for themselves, which for the most part they do. The main area where Mass Effect 2 struggles to show the consequences of your decisions is with regards to decisions made in the first game that have an impact on this one. This further supports the theory that the trilogy was not quite as well planned out as BioWare has tried to have us believe. At the end of Mass Effect, you decided whether to save the Council or save the human ships, and then you chose who should be the Alliance representative on the Council. Depending on what you did, in Mass Effect 2 you might have a pleasant conversation with the Council where they reinstate you as a Spectre, or they might refuse to speak to you. Tensions could be running high between Shepard and Captain Anderson, or you could still be good friends. However, as you might remember from the beginning of this video, we don't have much to do with the Alliance this time around. Perhaps this is why. BioWare would have had to write many more lines if it had to account for major decisions such as this throughout the second game. It was easier to give you a new boss of sorts and place Udina and Anderson on the periphery. In my Paragon playthrough, the Council reinstated me as a Spectre, but on only one occasion did I ever invoke this Spectre status to get my own way. In Mass Effect 1 I might as well have had Spectre tattooed on my forehead because everyone knew it straight away. This time around people would constantly try to block my way, and I would typically have to talk my way past them by using Paragon speech options. Why not just tell them I'm a Spectre and demand they comply? My guess is that this would also have required too many extra lines with associated voice acting. I'm slightly surprised the Council bothered to reinstate my Spectre status at all, to be honest. They could have made up some excuse not to, since it was clear they didn't trust Shepard anymore. Another major decision in Mass Effect 1 was whether or not to kill Rex when he rebelled on Virmire. Again, you can't argue that this decision doesn't have visible consequence in the sequel, it clearly does. Rex is not only still alive in my Paragon playthrough, he's head of the Urdnot clan on Tuchanka, and you can have lengthy conversations with him. Rex has some ambitious plans for Tuchanka, and as far as Krogans go he's basically a liberal. Conversely, if you killed Rex, his brother has taken charge and has far more traditional views. Maybe Mass Effect 3 will play out these decisions in more detail, but in Mass Effect 2 these differences don't mean a lot. You can still do Grunt and Mordin's loyalty missions. Rex or his brother are just there for optional conversations. Visiting Tuchanka is optional in the first place. I get the impression BioWare was only comfortable showing one layer of consequence via Mass Effect 1 decisions and didn't want further decisions to get layered on top of that one because it would have become too complicated. I'd have loved to have brought Rex back into the crew, but then he would have needed a loyalty mission of his own, which not everyone would have been able to play, and yeah, it's fair enough that BioWare didn't want to go to those lengths. It's understandable, even if it's still a touch disappointing. Conversely, I was pleasantly surprised to find so many callbacks to smaller decisions you made in the first game and characters you met. There's Gianna, who you may or may not have helped with her investigation back on Noveria. There's people you helped on Feros, the mother of the greeter of the Asari consort, who tragically died during the attack on the Citadel, and many more. These constant run-ins with familiar faces can make the galaxy feel a little small at times. When you consider how many billions of people are dotted around the galaxy, it's a minor miracle you ever see the same face twice. I can live with this though. Let's just pretend these other characters are keeping an eye on you and your meetings aren't entirely coincidental. Their side quests are often short and easily resolved, but they still do a decent job building the world. If you're going to solve a problem for a random NPC, it might as well be an NPC you recognise from the previous game. There are also a load of callbacks to specific decisions you might have made, such as whether or not to save the Rachni Queen. It's more akin to casual name dropping than anything meaningful, but it's nice to be reminded of past events. Overall, world building isn't quite as strong in the sequel, but there are enough of these smaller touches that I enjoyed spending time in each location. For example, while on Ilium you can hear people arguing about stock prices, listen to a corporate apology video for a supposedly offensive movie, and hear about a suspected thief that we can later recruit for our team. Even walking around the ship provides nice moments, such as the crewmates who are always talking about their families, with the lines changing as the story progresses. I kept checking back in on them just to see how they were getting on. The crew will regularly complain about the food unless you help out the chef with some new ingredients, in which case they will sing its praises. Unfortunately, a few times NPC conversations would shatter the illusion instead of enhance it. While helping Tali on her loyalty mission, the Quarians had a conversation about Shepard and Tali and whether we would ever come back alive. We had just come back from completing the mission and were standing right next to them at the time.
There has been no word. There is no reason to think Tali Zora survived.
It sounds like the hearing is already underway.
We must trust Shepard's offer of assistance. It's only been a few hours.
This happened on both playthroughs, so I don't think it was a bug. Speaking of weird speech bugs or oversights, Shepard will talk during combat as if she has companions, even when she was on a solo DLC mission.
Taking heavy fire!
And Miranda spoke to Shepard from the cockpit of the Normandy even though she'd been selected for her team and was standing right next to Shepard.
Better get back up here, Commander.
We're about to clear the debris field.
Shepard often feels like the most infamous person in the universe and simultaneously completely unknown. Random Solarians on Omega will recognise you, but in one of the DLC missions, Shepard can sneak into a party unrecognised. However, during that party you can hear people talking about Shepard. Do they only know the name and not the face? By the way, after completing this DLC mission you can wear this dress around the ship and, well, I'm not sure BioWare fully thought through the consequences of giving the character a dress to wear. Actually, the DLC is worth spending time discussing, especially because I had to pay $22 for it 8 years after its release. Despite having an Origin Access Premier membership, which gives you free access to all new EA games and the DLC, I had to separately buy the Mass Effect 2 DLC for what I think was the same price it originally sold for when new. Thankfully there's some great content in here, including one of the best pieces of DLC I've played. Lair of the Shadow Broker is a lengthy side quest for Liara Tassoni, who wants to hunt down the infamous Shadow Broker. Liara never officially becomes a companion, but she will fight alongside you during parts of these missions. You initially team up with another Spectre, Tela Vasir, to find Liara after an assassin attempts to kill her. It doesn't come as a huge shock to find out that Tela is the assassin. You end up chasing her through the skies, controlling a flying cab as you try to avoid the bombs she leaves in her wake. After defeating Tela, you enter the Shadow Broker's lair, and much to my surprise you actually meet him, or at least one version of him. The current Shadow Broker is a Yarg who the previous Shadow Broker brought on board as a pet. The pet eventually overpowered his owner and took over the mantle of Shadow Broker. Mass Effect doesn't have many memorable boss fights, but the encounter with the Shadow Broker is definitely one of them. After defeating the current incarnation of the Shadow Broker, Liara takes up the role herself. Liara opens up all the Shadow Broker's files on your crewmates, including their personal emails. I stopped reading after a few minutes. It felt wrong to snoop through their private correspondence, even if it did help flesh out their characters. Shepard's relationship with Liara is probably the strongest in the game outside of any romantic encounters you might have. Liara is also lonely. She understands Shepard. Shepard understands her. It would have been great to spend more time with Liara, but perhaps a bit of distance is best for both of them. Another memorable mission is Overlord. At first it felt a little too similar to a side quest for Mass Effect 1 and even another quest within this game. Essentially you go and track down a rogue virtual intelligence. Whereas Mass Effect 1 just pitted us against loads of drones and had a text pop up at the end, Overlord throws you into a virtual world and gives you flashbacks of a scientist called Archer as he tries to mesh together a human with a VI, hoping that it will be able to communicate with the Geth. There's lots of trippy stuff such as doors opening and closing to direct you down certain paths, and a VI that sounds like it's in genuine pain. Remember earlier when I mentioned that the Elusive Man can make you do terrible things even without directly ordering it? Well, the Elusive Man threatens to shut down this project, and Archer ends up so desperate that he uses his autistic brother as the core. David has been trapped here in pain for years. Once you've freed him, you can choose to send David to Grissom Academy, which is a training centre for gifted biotics, and will be familiar to anyone who has read Ascension. The DLC also included 2 new characters, Zaid and Kasumi, a master thief. These characters have their own loyalty missions and have lines of dialogue particular to the events of the story if you bring them along on missions. However, Kasumi doesn't have much in the way of extended conversations to get stuck into. There are some smaller pieces of content such as the underwhelming Firewalker missions that have you doing some vehicle-based platforming for the 2 or 3 people in the world who enjoy that kind of thing. There's one section we have to move through a cold climate to stop the vehicle from freezing, and I legitimately got Andromeda flashbacks.
Warning. Engine temperature below recommended parameters.
You can also visit the Normandy crash site and place a memorial for your dead colleagues. There are short flashbacks to life on board the old ship, which is clearly supposed to tug at the heartstrings. At the risk of sounding overly cold-hearted, this mission didn't do a lot for me. Largely because the Normandy was rebuilt almost as an exact replica. The flashbacks can't elicit much emotion when all they're doing is reminding me of a ship that is identical to the one I arrived here on. If Mass Effect 2 had a new ship, I could completely imagine this being a powerful moment, but with ready access to a new Normandy, it was hard to care all that much. So that's 2 great pieces of DLC, some cool new characters and some forgettable content. Nothing terrible until Arrival. I didn't enjoy this piece of DLC at all. There's nothing inherently wrong with the basic quest design, it's just the story is a complete mess in a way that negatively affects the main story. The arrival in question is the arrival of the Reapers. You know, the main threat to the galaxy hanging over everything that happens in the main story. After the destruction of the Citadel, the Reapers plan to invade the galaxy via a new mass relay and will show up in 2 days unless the mass relay can be destroyed. If this sounds familiar, then congratulations, you paid attention to the events of the first game where this was essentially the main plot. Stopping the Reapers from invading the galaxy via one specific relay was what we spent the entire story doing. The Reapers are barely mentioned in the main story this time around, but there's a small piece of DLC that tries to make you think they are only hours from destroying the galaxy. It's a terrible clash of themes. At the end of Arrival, you destroy the mass relay by hitting it with an asteroid, even though this kills over 300,000 Batarians in the vicinity. The Paragon choice is to warn the Batarians before it happens, even though it doesn't help much. The whole point of Arrival is to set up Mass Effect 3, where Shepard is back on Earth having been punished for destroying the Batarian colony, hence the lack of choice offered here. However, there has to be a better way to achieve this. The main story of Mass Effect 2 is about stopping the Collectors, who are in turn working for the Reapers. Arrival's story makes a mockery of all that by presenting a much more important problem that takes place alongside it. The problem could have been solved by having Arrival only be playable after completing the main campaign. Then it would function better as an epilogue instead of being sandwiched in the middle of the story. Speaking of which, now is as good a time as any to wrap up talking about the main story, because once all the companion loyalty missions are complete, it kicks into gear a bit. After receiving a Turian distress signal, Shepard heads off to a destroyed Collector ship to find out what happened. It's all a little too convenient, and sure enough it turns out to be a trap. Worst of all, the Elusive Man knew it was a trap but sent Shepard anyway. I don't understand his rationale for this. He says it's because the information Shepard was able to extract from the Collector ship was crucial to getting through the Omega-4 relay, but we would have gone to get that information anyway. This, of course, sows a deep distrust between Shepard and the Elusive Man, so she refuses to work with him anymore and goes her own way from now. Oh no, wait, she just waves it off and gets back to work. We also get the big reveal about the Collectors. I say big reveal, but you might already know depending on what side quests you've done up until this point. The Collectors are actually the Protheans, or at least they're bastardised versions of the Protheans. They've been modified by the Reapers in much the same way that the Reapers turned humans into husks. I reckon this reveal is supposed to be Mass Effect 2's equivalent of the conversation with Sovereign in Mass Effect 1, but it falls well short, because we don't care about the Collectors, and the reveal doesn't really change anything. We've long known that the Collectors are working for the Reapers, however most of the story has involved gathering our crew and gaining their loyalty, so you'd be forgiven for having forgotten the Collectors when the time comes to invade their downed ship. As for them being Protheans, well, I mean, they aren't. They're genetically altered shells of what the Protheans used to be. We can probably infer from this that the Protheans were bipedal, which is likely always the case, but that doesn't tell us anything new about them as a species. The most interesting part of this reveal is the potential for humanity to become enslaved in much the same way. The next job is to pick up a friend or foe device, which we can use to get through the Omega-4 relay without getting shot down immediately on the other side. This is when you meet Legion, who you can invite to join your crew or sell to Cerberus for parts. Selling him is largely pointless, but my Renegade Shepard did it anyway because he didn't trust Geths, even though this one saved him during the mission. After this, Shepard and her crew are conveniently shunted off the Normandy due to a potential problem with the friend or foe device, and what would you know? While they're away, the Normandy is invaded by collectors and all the crew except Joker are kidnapped. This scene is actually pretty cool if you just roll with it and try to avoid the blatantly contrived way in which this came about. You play as Joker for a bit and sneak around the Normandy before giving Evie full control of the ship. It reminds me of the opening and that it's all style over substance, but despite what you might think from my physical appearance, I don't mind being stylish. Best to move through here quickly though, because this area does have a tendency to bug out a bit. The ship is now nearly empty. The crew members who are discussing their families' attempts to make it to safety are gone. Kelly isn't there to tell me there's a private message at my terminal. No one is praising the food anymore. The deck is deadly silent and it's horrible. After this mission, you're ready to go through the relay and rescue your crew. You can continue to dither and do DLC or loyalty missions that you haven't yet finished, however, talk about the mission being urgent isn't just there to impose a fake sense of urgency. The urgency is real and I had no idea. I waited too long, and when I finally went through the relay to rescue my crew, I found them all dead except Dr. Chakwas. I wasn't in time to save the wonderful Kelly Chambers, the woman I'd been romancing the entire game. This was devastating punishment for not prioritising her rescue in the first place. I didn't take the warning seriously and I was punished. It's not a mistake I plan to make again. Mass Effect 2 enters its powerful conclusion with the Suicide Run. This is where everything comes to a head and it's truly epic. Mass Effect 2's intro is well made, but this sequence is a collection of money shots. You pass through the relay and all hell breaks loose. You always make it to the collector base, but you might lose companions along the way if you didn't complete all the ship upgrades. The entire sequence is tense and there's a real feeling of satisfaction when you make it to the other side. This is undeniably the single best part of Mass Effect 2 and it achieves what I refer to as the hair on the back of the neck standing on end effect. Part of what makes this scene so special is how what happens in the cutscenes directly ties into your relatively minor actions earlier in the game. If you diligently did the planet scanning nonsense and collected resources, you would have been able to build a few enhancements for the Normandy that come in use right about now. If you listen to Garrus, you have a powerful new weapon that can tear right through a collector ship. A shield can protect you from a powerful laser. This all inherently makes sense, right? You take the time to collect resources and use those resources to improve your ship. In turn, you're able to take and deal more damage. Great stuff. What doesn't make sense is the way each crew member's fate is determined by whether or not you completed their loyalty mission. You have to pick a crew member to unlock a door. They will always manage to get the door open, but whether or not they die in the process is apparently determined based on how much they like you. Similarly, you have to make decisions about who to place in command of a second team, who to send back to the ship to escort any surviving crew members, and who to help create a biotic field to keep away the flies. Depending on who you pick and their loyalty to you, you can make it to the end with everyone alive, everyone dead, or something in between. I like the idea, or at least the kernel of the idea. As we saw during the previous cutscene, having your actions from earlier in the game affect your ending can make the outcome here a lot harder, but there has to be a better way to achieve this. I don't think it would even take much more work. Let's say you chose Tali to open the locked door. What if, during her loyalty mission, she learned a new skill or found a device that improved her lockpicking ability? With this device, she's able to get through the door before she can be attacked. Nothing much would need to change, but it would sure have made me a lot happier. Other changes might have taken a little more work. What about, say, Miranda leading the secondary team? During her loyalty quest, she could have done something that proved her leadership abilities and gave the crew confidence in her. This has got to be better than just loyalty to Shepard making her go above and beyond. As much as this seems like a huge and obvious flaw to me now, I must admit it didn't bother me all that much on my initial playthrough all those years ago. If you just do one run and don't think about why the ending is playing out the way it is, it's perfectly possible to enjoy this and move on. Looking at it now though, not great. There are some brilliant moments on the way to the final boss, especially if you have connected to the companions that you're now placing in harm's way, such as having to open valves in time for Tali to make it through the pipes. It turns fairly rote quest design into something genuinely tense. One thing that I thought 8 years ago and still think now is that the final boss is an absolute joke. The boss is up there with demon-faced Shepard for immersion breaking and ridiculous decisions that have no place in Mass Effect. Both the actual design of the boss and the story reason behind its design do a huge disservice to the story and should never have made it past the presumably drunk brainstorming phase. I'm not even entirely sure I understand what's going on here, but I'm loath to spend more time trying to figure it out than the writers did creating it. So apparently the collectors have been harvesting humans to feed their bodies to this human-shaped machine, which will eventually become the physical body for a Reaper because... no, I have no idea. This future Reaper is easily defeated because, despite its size, the Reaper is in an early stage, the equivalent to an embryo. Another supposedly big reveal is that the Harbinger, who occasionally pops up to taunt you during fights with Collectors, is actually a Reaper who is controlling the Collectors, but I thought that was the case anyway. I didn't realise I was supposed to think otherwise. So once again, Shepard saves the galaxy, but it doesn't feel anywhere near as satisfying as last time. The first game spent all that time building up the threat of the Reapers, and the sequel does nothing with them. I never cared at all about the Collectors. They pop up out of nowhere, and the attempt to give them an interesting history by having them be Protheans just falls flat. This is all after a first and second act that provided little in the way of motivational impetus to push things forward. A couple of the required quests start automatically, which makes me wonder whether BioWare knew people wouldn't care about them otherwise, so forces you into them. There might have been a Skyrim situation otherwise where people end up never completing the campaign. Mass Effect 2's story isn't exactly bad, it's just uninteresting, and that's a huge problem when you look at how good the first game's story was. At the beginning of the video I said that Mass Effect 1's story was like a movie, whereas this one is like a TV show. The ending backs that up. Movies typically have a hard conclusion. There may be plenty of room for sequels, but generally they try to reach a satisfying resolution to the main story of the movie. There are usually years between movies, and despite the recent trend of cinematic universes and all that stuff, there is typically no guarantee of a sequel in the first place. With Mass Effect 1, BioWare didn't know they would get to make a sequel, so it finished the story with a satisfying ending that left the door open for more story. Compare films to television, where seasons generally have a much softer ending. TV shows are rarely commissioned in the first place if there isn't potential for more than one season, especially in the US. The cost of creating sets and establishing a new property are prohibitive in the first year and then cheaper in subsequent years. In video game speak, the TV shows are able to reuse assets. The actors might demand more money if the show is incredibly successful, but if it's doing that well, the network can afford it. Even if a TV show ends its season with a satisfying conclusion to the story, there will nearly always be room for more adventures, and those are often teased in that final episode. There's a presumption that there will be a new episode in 4 to 5 months' time. Doing anything else would be practically asking for cancellation, or at least that seems to be the line of thinking. Mass Effect 2's ending felt a lot like this to me. It's a soft ending. Technically a story arc has reached a conclusion, but not the one we care most about, and there's a teaser for Season 3 right at the end. We know Season 3 is coming, although unlike television shows the wait is more like 2 years than 4 months. Outside of the main campaign there are plenty of great moments that you could easily miss. There's a great moment where a guy completely misunderstands his wife's enthusiasm for him leaving their homeworld with a classic eye roll in the background.
Getting the whole getup was pretty expensive, but my wife was really supportive. She even paid for my shuttle fare off-world.
Or there's Edie's sense of humour at the worst possible moment.
You want me to go crawling through the ducts again?
I enjoy the sight of humans on their knees. That is a joke.
Right.
During the Shadow Broker DLC mission, there's a not so subtle reference to how fans disliked Omnigel in the first game.
Liara, I'm sure it won't be much longer. Remember the old days when you could just slap Omnigel on everything?
That security upgrade made a lot of people unhappy.
There were a few missteps as well. Moments that feel like a lack of due care and attention. When Shepard is told about the Reaper threat, she responds by saying, "So why call me?" As if she wasn't infamous throughout the galaxy for dealing with the Reapers.
Dr. Kenson recently reported that she found evidence of an imminent Reaper invasion.
So why call me?
The first Mass Effect had a side quest where you could find a Prothean globe that gave you a glimpse into the history of this mysterious race. Mass Effect 2 has one of those as well, except it shrinks down and then it becomes the galaxy's most expensive paperweight, I guess. It's not just the storytelling style that drastically changes between Mass Effect 1 and 2. BioWare significantly revamped the combat to be more like an action game, which, bear in mind the time period, meant it had to be a cover-based shooter. I'm not going to go on a huge rant about cover-based shooters. Suffice to say I find most of them fairly boring now, although I don't remember taking any particular issue with them back in 2010. A YouTuber called Turbo Button has an excellent video on why cover shooters are bad, and I highly recommend you watch it. There's a link in the description. 8 years after that initial playthrough, I can't stand the sight of rooms full of chest-high walls and crates. I get this feeling of impending boredom, only rivaled by conversations speculating about which characters are going to be in the next Smash Brothers game. There can be comfort and familiarity, but not here. This will sound somewhat idiotic, but while I hid behind cover a lot in Mass Effect 1, I didn't consider it a cover-based shooter. Perhaps that's because it wasn't much of a shooter at all. You don't need to move around a lot, so combat was merely a case of prioritising the most threatening enemies first and hoping that the bullet spray would let you get a couple of hits in. It was still clearly an RPG despite the real-time combat. Mass Effect 2 was designed as a cover-based shooter from the ground up. You're expected to run into new areas and slide behind the first piece of cover you see. Shepard sticks to cover so readily that I'd advise against running at all in crowded combat arenas unless you want to end up attached to cover, because it's nigh on impossible to avoid it. You have limited control while sprinting, so mobility in combat is restricted. You're clearly told that cover is the way to play, and if you must leave cover, you damn well better be on your way to another piece of cover. Health and ammo have both been tweaked. You now have regenerating health, because what cover-based shooter is complete without combat being largely devoid of any risk so long as you play things safe. Mass Effect 1's regenerating ammo system would have also been a perfect fit for this approach, however BioWare changed it so you have to pick up ammo packs this time. On the rare occasion your 4 weapon types run out of ammo, you have to leave cover to get more. This would be welcome if movement weren't so awkward. I'm surprised BioWare bothered making any changes. If the idea of ammo packs was to force players to leave cover occasionally, why not just use health packs to fulfill the same function? That way you wouldn't have the bizarre scenario where weapons work in a completely different way between 2 games in the same universe. Ammo is largely generic, so you only have to worry about one type which covers your 3 main weapons and then power cells that are specifically for your heavy weapon. These heavy weapons are incredible. A personal highlight has to be the nuke launcher. Yes, it looks ridiculous to launch a nuke just feet in front of you, sometimes while you're on a spaceship, but I'm going to give it a pass because it looks and sounds satisfying as hell. Ammo for these heavy weapons is just about rare enough that you won't use it for standard enemy encounters, but common enough that by the time you reach the end of each area you should have enough to deal with the boss in the most badass way possible. I expected combat in Mass Effect 2 to be a huge leap up from that of the first game. Initially I was disappointed due to how slow and unresponsive it all felt, however I soon got used to it. Biotic powers in particular are a lot more exciting to use, and by the end I was flinging them around with abandon. Cooldowns have been reduced, and by the time you've leveled them up you can deal huge amounts of damage. Speaking of the levelling system, it's been drastically cut down from the first game with less than half the options for improving your character. I'm glad BioWare removed the option to spend points on your charm and intimidation abilities, however the rest of it could have stayed. I rarely felt like I was making any decisions of note when it came to levelling up my character. I just bought the next thing available and waited till I had more points. Similarly with squad members, the only interesting decision I made was not spending points until I had unlocked loyalty abilities. Squad mates still feel useless on occasion, although it's a big step up from the last game. They don't know what to do when rushed by husks, so encounters which should have been easy were strangely challenging, as my teammates seemed unable to line up shots against opponents that were inconsiderate enough to, move. Of course the enemy AI tends to be just as dumb for the most part. In the first game when you saw a Krogan you knew you had to focus your efforts on it before it charged you down. They were deadly. In the sequel they often stay at range despite being equipped with shotguns. I remember one encounter where they were perched behind cover at a distance as if they were snipers, occasionally popping up to randomly spray shotgun shells everywhere. Overall, combat was more enjoyable, but barely. If you meet it halfway you can have fun, but don't expect anything particularly thrilling. Highlights are moments such as shooting canisters on the backs of flamethrower enemies, which is hardly all that sophisticated. Combat is slightly easier than the first game. I played on Veteran again for my main playthrough, but should have probably turned it up one notch with hindsight. The second half especially didn't contain much in the way of a challenge, and that was without doing the sniper build. From my experience as a sniper on my Renegade playthrough, they appear to be way overpowered. There are 2 hacking minigames this time. One where you have to match up code isn't too bad because you can get pretty damn quick at it, but I still prefer the dial in the first game. Matching up logos though is tiresome. For my second playthrough I used a mod which let me skip these sections entirely. 0 regrets. Speaking of skipping tiresome bullshit the second time around, I used a mod to gather all resources on a planet with just one probe, which makes life so much easier. To be fair, planet scanning wasn't quite as onerous as I remember. I was able to get all the upgrades I wanted without having to go too far out of my way. However, any time spent planet scanning is wasted time in my opinion. The resource economy would have been a lot better if it were the only in-game economy. You use resources to build upgrades to the ship and your weapons and armour after you found the appropriate schematics out in the field. This part is relatively well balanced. You don't need to constantly switch up your weapons, but every now and again you will get something new and shiny to play with. The big mystery is why credits exist. The system of credits in Mass Effect 2 is one of the most useless currencies I can remember having in a game. I had over 500,000 at the end of my first playthrough and could never find much to do with them. You buy a few new guns from merchants, but more often than not you'll find something better in the field. I don't know why credits even exist in the game. Cerberus has near limitless resources. Clearly you would never need to scrounge for money. This is the organisation that spent billions to bring you back to life. They aren't going to deprive you of a couple of hundred credits if you want to buy a model ship for your office or a pretend copy of the Ascension novel. They'd also buy you any weapon money could buy, making any attempt at an economy somewhat redundant unless money can't buy all the weapons you need. That's where having to gather rare resources and do research is a great fit. It's easy enough to imagine that Cerberus might be short of materials needed or the technical expertise to turn those materials into more capable shotguns or a stronger shield. The entire economy should have been based around the need for materials and credits should have been left out entirely. Okay, so I think Mass Effect 2 is a disappointing follow-up to Mass Effect, however it's far from a bad game. It's easy to point out its problems and harder to defend its strengths. I love spending time with the companions and the writing is largely excellent, however that's tough to convey in video critiques such as this one. It's much easier to point out the missteps in the story and the obvious lack of direction when compared to its predecessor. Mass Effect 2 isn't going to end up my favourite game in the series, let alone of all time, but I can completely understand why others will disagree. It comes down to what you're looking for. Are you a Fallout 1 guy who never forgets the need for the water chip to save your vault and prioritises that above all else? Or are you a Fallout 2 guy who just wants to get lost in a world, or galaxy in this case, and sees story missions as an unwanted intrusion on forming friendships? Your own style will likely dictate which of these two Mass Effect games you prefer. If you're one of those people who prefer Mass Effect 2 and you still made it to the end of this video, then congratulations because I know it must have been tough. It's a great game, but the nature of these critiques, especially ones done years after the fact, is that they are going to sway more negative than a timely product review. Plus I like to be controversial. If you enjoyed the video, please hit like, subscribe if you haven't already, and consider sharing the video in the appropriate places. If you want to go one step further and support me directly, then please consider donating to my Patreon. The link is in the description. I don't have any tiers, $1 a month gets you into the credits and a Patreon role in my Discord. The Mass Effect 3 video will be coming in the new year, probably in February, but it might slip to March. Your homework for that video is to read the novels Retribution and Deception, along with the comics Conviction, Invasion, Homeworlds and Inquisition. The plan for December is to release a bunch of video reviews for indie games that I've been playing, as well as a review for Hitman 2. I was going to do the next video in my isometric CRPG series, but releasing a video on Icewind Dale just before Christmas didn't feel very, well, Christmassy, I guess. January is a better fit. As always, this is subject to change, but one way or another you should expect smaller videos next month instead of lengthy ones like this. Okay, thanks for your time. Cheers.